Well, good afternoon everyone and welcome to the City Bible Forum here today. My name is Robert and I'm the Director of the City Bible Forum here in Melbourne. The City Bible Forum is a place where we ask the big questions of life, and this week we're doing a series on things we shouldn't talk about: death, religion and politics. And with an election looming, why not have a conversation about them all? So today's topic is that of leadership. And recent opinion polling has suggested that Australians aren't particularly impressed with the leaders of the major political parties. The latest news poll revealed that just 29% approve of Julia Gillard and 36% approve of Tony Abbott. It appears to be a crisis of leadership in Australia's political amphitheater at the moment. And that's the topic that we're exploring today. Today I'll just explain that we have Ian Powell from City Bible Forum to come to present to us on this. I just want to give you an outline of what's going to happen today. I'm going to briefly introduce Ian, then he's going to speak for about 20 minutes or so. Then there'll be a forum where we welcome questions, comments and interaction. This is a forum, and so we do welcome all opinions and so on as well. If you could hold it to that particular time, that would be much appreciated. You can submit questions via the SMS number provided, or you can also put your hand up and have a conversation as well. So we welcome all opinions and so on. It's great to have you here today with us. I'd like now to introduce Ian Powell. Ian is widely regarded as one of Australia's leading Christian communicators, and he speaks regularly around the country and internationally, engaging the big questions of life. He works with City Bible Forum and is based in Sydney, and we're very privileged to have him join us here today. So please welcome Ian Powell.
Well, I was chatting with a friend of mine who's a great advocate of the Labor Party, sends me constant little posters about what a rat Tony is, and hands out leaflets, and he's actively involved in the political process. And we agreed that it feels like the next election as if we've got a choice between two dead ends. Not particularly overjoyed to vote for either. That's us personally. I'm sure other people can't wait to get in and vote. Probably more, as is the Australian way, anti the government rather than with enthusiasm for the opposition, but we're all over the place with that. Tony or Julia, many who would rather be voting, say, between Malcolm and Bill Shorten. There's quite a few people who reckon they would be a much better choice. We'll see what happens. When I was trying to research some of this, the idea of a crisis in leadership, where I found repeated arguments and articles about this was about the EU, the European Union, and in the crisis that they're in. And a whole series of quotes from a retired senior German politician and journalist who says the real crisis of the EU and the monetary union is not financial but political. Or more precisely, it's a leadership crisis. A lack of vision, courage and strength of purpose is on display in all European capitals. You may guess by that he's not in government at the moment. As Sean O'Grady from The Independent says this, it comes against a backdrop of worried investors throughout the world despairing at the lack of political leadership being shown in the world's various sovereign debt crises. Now, I honestly don't know whether or not we're in the middle of a leadership crisis. It's hard to tell, I think, when you're in the middle of anything, exactly what's happening. There's an argument that really Kevin Rudd and Wayne Swan did a truly magnificent thing when they secured all people bank deposits up to $1 million. Certainly, according to an eminent Victorian professor of economics, they really did, and it was by no means certain, he thought, that would stop a possible run on the banks, and at least one of our banks closing. He said we got much closer to a complete meltdown in the GFC in Australia than most Australians realise. And he said it wasn't the people, punters like me who know nothing much about economics. He said it was the people who built the system, like him. He was involved in the restructuring of a whole lot of the financial systems in our country. He said it was people like me that were fearful and actually were taking out large sums of money from my account and hiding it around the house. He said it with some level of sending himself up, but he said, and it may be that we actually have had better leaders than we like. I don't particularly warm to Kevin Rudd. I find Wayne Swan irritating, but maybe we've actually had better leadership in our country than we're aware of. Now, it's interesting always, I think, to define things. When we talk about leadership, most people find themselves in leadership before they realise it, and then perhaps go and study it, except for those who aspire to leadership in some way. So I discovered that I was a leader in a way that I hadn't meant to in a moderately large church I was leading in Australia. It's big in terms of in the land of the pygmies. In many parts of the world it wouldn't be considered a large church. It was large in Sydney, staff of 6 or 7 full-time people. So I began to read about leadership to try and work out what this thing was. And in a sense, leadership can be described as either influence. Anyone who influences something is having some measure of leadership. So we have people who lead opinions. So there are all sorts of people who we don't know, who we don't vote for. If we probably knew them, we wouldn't trust them, but who really are shaping the whole way that our culture thinks. So in terms of advertisers, the real power, as I understand it with advertisers, is not the product they're selling to us. It's the assumptions that they make along with us about what we all aspire to, what we all need. That's almost more powerful than the particular product. It's the assumptions that you wanted, then they try to give their idea of how we're going to get there, their product as perhaps being the best answer. I'm not anti-advertising. It has a legitimate place in our culture, I would have thought. So it can be just having influence. So you are in leadership in all sorts of places, influencing and changing, therefore, what happens. But I guess the main picture of leadership is I just thought of this myself. So it's, most of my thoughts I live to regret. But I think for myself, and leadership is in a sense doing a Moses. Now, whether or not you believe in the Old Testament story, or whether or not you like it, you may be aware of the central drama in the middle of the story of the Bible, which really is absolutely, it's got the same place in the Old Testament as the death and resurrection have in the New Testament, in the second half of the Bible, is the story of Moses and the Exodus. Moses is kind of a picture of what we understand a leader to be. There's a situation, it's of slavery and genocide, which is what the Egyptian government was doing to the Jews, killing the boys, taking the girls. The Jews, the Israelis, were involved in genocide. They were being genocided. No particular future for them. Life was awful and miserable. Moses comes and he leads them to the promised land through a journey. So he has a vision given to him by God. He has some sort of a plan, not much of a plan, but he works it out as he goes along with God, and he gets them from A to B. Leadership, that's what sort of political leadership does, or community leadership. It takes us from A to B. It's clearest when you've got a terrible crisis, and it takes you out of the possible utter disaster to somewhere fresh. Leaders do that. They take an organisation, they take a family, they take a community, they take a nation, and they take them from this situation to that. They're agents of change, which is why it's a dangerous thing to do. And the story of Moses, that is one of the best pictures of what good leadership can do, and the pains, the terrible pains that Moses endures going through that. Now you probably know that the story of the Exodus massively, for generations, informed the Black American community, the African American community. Martin Luther's 2 most famous speeches, I Have a Dream, and the one he preached just before he died, I've Been to the Mountaintop. I mean, you can't understand those with any real gut level of understanding without knowing the Bible story. It's full. Both of them are laced with the Bible. The last one, most obviously, because when he's talking about going to the mountain, he's talking about what happened to Moses. Moses was taken to the top of the mountain and shown the promised land. If you look up that speech, it's quite short. It's quite moving. He says, we will get to the promised land. I may not get there with you. And he's shot a couple of days later. He's aware of the danger he's in. But this story of Moses as the leader who takes you from A to B, really, that whole story of God doing that through leaders informed the whole Martin Luther King thing. And the Jesus part of it informed the non-violence part of it. It's why that movement was so despised by a tiny group within the African American community, and why lots of white people liked it, because it had the Jesus, let's not be violent thing going. You might not know that in Melbourne here you had a similar group of people called the Australian Aboriginal League. Have you heard of these guys? William Cooper was the famous Aboriginal leader, massively inspired by Jesus. William Cooper, the early studies on him and his group, historians assumed they were Marxists, because they've got this blinkered view that Christianity is never very dangerous politically, although it is historically so often, and if they're concerned about freedom, it must be Marxism. Of course, there's no Marxist influence at all that we know of in the Australian Aboriginal League. But William Cooper was a Christian man, and he met some African Americans, and they spoke about the Exodus, being brought out of slavery, being brought to a new place. This infected William Cooper, and the Australian Aboriginal League. And on the night of Crystal Night, you know, when kind of the Nazis began to do obvious horrible things to the Jewish community back in '38, the only place in the world where there was a public demonstration against that horrible act of racism that began, you know, led to much worse things, was here in Melbourne. And it was led by William Cooper and the Australian Aboriginal League. William Cooper, a leader inspired by what God did through Moses, etc., inspired his own people. They just said, they're a long way from being Jewish, the Australian Aboriginals. But they understood, here is a group of people being persecuted because of their race. We know what that's like, that mustn't happen. So they went across the Yarra, across to the German consulate, marched, about 70 of them, and if you go to Jerusalem, there's a forest there, I think it's called the Garden of the Martyrs, or the Righteous Gentile something. There's a bunch of Australian trees commemorating a thing that most Australians have never heard of. But it's the Moses thing, and that's what leaders can do at their best. I don't know if you've got any favourite leaders. William Cooper's becoming one of mine, but I don't know enough about him as yet. He's dead. You got any favourite leaders? Just either alive or dead? Anyone jump to mind and think of a great leader?
John Monash.
John Monash, the General, Melbourne.
Franklin Roosevelt.
Franklin Roosevelt. Now, is this the guy, the Second World War guy, the Depression period?
He was American president through the Second World War, yeah.
Okay. Franklin Roosevelt. Okay.
Nelson Mandela.
Nelson Mandela. For me, it's guys like the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury. All the work he did there transforming things in England for the poor. William Wilberforce is another one. Dr. Bernardo. One of the interesting things about men who lead great periods of change, who lead through difficult things, is how hated they often are in their own time. Often profoundly admired later on. So Dr. Bernardo, who Bernardo Homes still operate, set up by him, just ran this massive charitable work in England. He was going to be an overseas medical missionary doctor, finished up discovering a terrible poverty in the middle of England, and he was the guy who coined the phrase deepest, darkest England. He was advocating for care for the poor within England. And he wrote to his daughter once saying, don't believe anything, don't worry about what you read about me in the press, I'm the most hated man in England. Now, people who know anything about him now know how extraordinarily admirable he was, but it's very common if you're a leader trying to get from A to B, an agent of change, that you finish up dead earlier than you should, or hated and despised. Now, one of the interesting characters in leadership is, of course, Jesus himself. I don't know if you think about it in terms of political leaders or group of community leaders, people who change things, but Jesus is obviously an enormous agent of change. Ted Turner himself, an interesting leader in business, in industry, said the inventor of CNN didn't want to die without owning a TV network. I thought that was an important thing for every man to have in his CV. He actually thought Jesus was a pathetic loser. He's one of the few guys who come back quite that strongly. He just thought he was a hopeless loser because he died. We didn't just die because everyone died. He was murdered by his enemies before he'd done almost anything. And he just thought to be overwhelmed by your enemies at the age of 33 is pathetic. And he thought that Christians were even more pathetic than Jesus. He said it's one thing to be a pathetic loser. It's another thing to deliberately choose to link yourself to someone who is obviously a loser. And yet, of course, from another point of view, if Jesus is anything other than that, by far the largest human movement in history was founded by him and is inspired by him and does all its best work when it's freshly focused on him. It's the largest single religion. You take so much of what we take as best about Western culture is directly a result of his work. Men who were directly inspired by Jesus and followed his leadership founded things like the Red Cross, founded by a banker. There you go, see if you're a banker. You can not only keep the wheels of the economy going, you can set up things like the Red Cross. Amnesty International, one I only recently discovered, was set up by an ordinary group of Christians who cared about people and discovered the power of writing letters. Even a lot of people in the original part of the Olympic Games, better or for worse, all sorts of institutions that we take for granted actually are they are unthinkable without Jesus. We just think they're just normal, but they actually go back to his particular influence. He actually talks about himself. I've been pondering this, but his own picture of leadership. He says, what he is, he said, what I'm doing in the kingdom of God, it's like the smallest seed, a mustard seed, that grows into the largest plant in the garden. And it's very interesting. I've been playing with this with some of my atheistic friends, saying, it's an interesting prophecy Jesus makes, isn't it? He said, it is small and pathetic. Some of my friends have been mocking me for how really Christianity was not even a large movement in its day. Like when Jesus was on the earth, it was a very small messianic movement, only had a couple of hundred people, and it was gone before we knew it. There are other ones that were minting coins and had thousands of people, and they've restarted the calendar, much bigger ones we hadn't heard of, because when the Messiah died, they died. But Jesus says, it is a really tiny thing, but it's going to produce... How could he have known that? They say, well, it was the early Christians. They didn't know it either. It was still a pathetic little organisation for hundreds and hundreds of years, and yet Jesus does say it'll be the largest thing on the planet. It's interesting. It's worth pondering that he got that so right, when there was no particular evidence for it. He started something very impressive, and a whole style of leadership which is commonly known as servant leadership. You might know a man called Jim Collins, who's done some important research and written some important work on leadership. He's famous for what he calls level 5 leaders, who are the men who bring lasting, magnificent change to organisations and or to countries. It's worth looking up. And he said when his group who used to go into companies and try to, these companies that had, I don't want to bore you with all the details, but they'd pick companies that had been running parallel for a long time, and they would get, and one of them had taken off. So they looked at Kimberly Scott was one, a paper company, as against some of the, and
Clark.
Kimberly
Clark.
Kimberly Clark, thank you. Scott was the other paper, yes. Anyhow, the fellow's name was Darwin E. Smith. And what they discovered, that they all had a similar type of leader that took them from into this massive period of sustained transformational growth. And he said when his team, who used to go to his companies and spend unspeakable hours reading through all the company papers trying to get to the root of what caused the change, he found his leadership team one time that they'd meet every few weeks holding hands. He came in and said, what's going on here? Looks like some sort of religious thing. He said, no, we're holding hands to give ourselves courage, because we're going to tell you something you hate. What's that? Because he said, we think what's the mark of all these companies at the crucial moment is a style of leadership. Because he had always thought that leadership was too lazy a term. You know, if a company goes well, leadership. If a company collapses, leadership. If a country goes well, leadership. He said it doesn't tell you anything. But they actually discovered a certain sort of leadership that they call level 5. It's worth looking up if you're interested in this sort of area further. But he said we nearly called it servant leadership. But he said that sounded too religious. The notion of the servant leader is an idea that goes back directly to Jesus. In the passage that you've got in front of you, he talks to his friends, his disciples, who never seem to get him right, that the mark of greatness is to be a servant. And the mark of great political leadership is to see yourself as a servant. I'm not a fan of John Howard. I'm really confused about him as a politician. But the one part what I liked what he said was Pauline Hanson made a comment decades ago. I like to think of myself as the mother of Australia. Someone said to John Howard, do you like to see yourself as the father? I said, no, I like to see myself as the servant of Australia. Now, whether or not he was or not, where does he get that idea from? It traces directly back to Jesus, who says the mark of greatness is to be a servant. The critical thing about leadership, political, military, wherever, companies, is character. All sorts of people are competent, and you can learn competencies. But I learned this particularly through Stormman Norman Schwarzkopf when he came to Australia back in the late 90s. He said in the military they've worked out its character. He said soldiers will kill in combat a leader that they've got that they don't trust. He said it happens more than we like to admit. They have to be able to trust their leader. They have to know that the leader is actually there for them. He may send them to their death. They get that, the soldiers, but they need to know that he's actually there for them and a higher cause, that his word is dependable. It's actually about being trustworthy, which is, I think, part of the problem for Julia Gillard. I don't wish her any ill. I rang her office probably within a week or two of becoming PM, the second after the election, because when she felt the need to break the promise about tax on carbon. And I rang just to say, look, there are some of us who actually think promises matter, and if you've got to change the promise, please explain. Don't just do it what seemed with a high hand at the time. She tried to explain it later. I think the damage is done. The question of a person's trustworthiness that they will keep their word, that they can be relied upon, that if they say they'll do something, they'll do it or die trying. That sort of thing. Now here's the problem. My mate, called Tony, who's a deep Labor supporter, is a really good guy. We've been having dialogues. He gets cranky because he thinks Tony Abbott lies. I say, yeah, but don't they all sometimes? Then he says they're all lies all the time. I say, no, I don't. I think the trouble when you say that about politicians, it makes it easy for them to lie, doesn't it? If we all go, they all lie, and they don't all lie. There's no evidence that all politicians all lie. But if you say they all lie, you're no longer shocked when they do. You actually make it easier. If I'm a politician who's a liar, I want you to believe we all lie. Because then when I lie, you won't hold me to account. I had a discussion with my friend saying, mate, the problem is you lie. We all lie. And then I said, but there are people I know, and including myself, I didn't say that at the time, who are absolutely committed not to lie. That lying really is as wrong as other horrendous things. It's very difficult for our community to get annoyed with politicians when they lie, when you lie. This is one of the problems for our community. We don't take truthfulness seriously. We don't take all those old-fashioned virtues seriously. We say part of the real life is realising everyone. No, they don't always lie. But you can't critique leaders for being untrustworthy if you are not a man or a woman of your word, that your word is your bond, both at work and at home, etc. So it's a question of character. It's a question of being a person who's worthy of trust, which will be being truthful and loving. The problem, I think, in our culture is we don't actually know how to produce people like that. We want our leaders to be like that, but we actually mock those sorts of virtues. C.S. Lewis talks about this decades ago. He says we mock courage, then we despise people who are cowards. We mock people who think, their word really matters, and then we get cranky when we're betrayed. We mock sexual purity, then when we are betrayed or our children are betrayed or something like that, we get angry. So we actually ask people to be the very thing that our culture tells them is not worth being. So in the end, I think the scary thing is that old saying, the old saying, a country gets the government it deserves? Have you heard that saying? I don't like it. It's very difficult for Australia to say, we don't like politicians who are selfish, who are just looking after their own superannuation, who are just looking after their career, who don't speak the truth, who live for the short-term gain, if that's what we are. And it's hard for us to, I think, to develop leaders in a culture where we despise those who go into that area. We say that they're all liars. And we ourselves are not those who live by important virtues such as truthfulness, love for others, being a servant rather than being served. All those things that our culture has derived, often knowingly and sometimes unknowingly, from the life and influence of Jesus on individuals and on a culture. Is there a crisis of leadership? Let's talk about that in 30 years. Maybe there are good leaders out there. It's hard to see without, war and other crises like that. So leadership is about influence. Leadership is taking people on a journey, hopefully to a better place, and it hangs on the question of character. Now I'll stop there, so we've got plenty of time to take specific questions that you might like to toss up. And do feel free to say, Ian, you know nothing, and we can have a frank discussion.
Sure.